I didn't plan to spy on my own home. It was 11:47 at night when I heard the floorboard outside our son's room creak again, slow and careful, the way my wife walked when she didn't want to be noticed. She said she was checking on him. She said that every night, standing in the dark hallway, listening to the door close, I realized something was very wrong, and whatever it was, I was already too late to stop it. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Parents worry, husbands overthink. That was the voice I trusted. As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while my wife slipped from our bed again. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you hear your own breathing. I watched the faint light from the hallway spill under the bedroom door, then disappear. Somewhere down the hall, our son's door opened and closed, gently, deliberately. She had an explanation ready every time. He had nightmares. He was going through a phase. He needed reassurance. I nodded, pretended to understand, pretended not to notice that she never turned on the light when she went in there. She moved like someone who didn't want to wake the house, or be seen. Lying there, counting my breaths, I felt something thin and sharp settle in my chest, the feeling you get when a truth circles you but hasn't landed yet. I'm not a suspicious man by nature. I spent my life working, providing, believing that loyalty was something you earned by being steady and present. My wife and I had built a routine that felt unbreakable. Dinner at the same time, the news murmuring in the background, our son doing homework at the table while she corrected his spelling. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, which is why the quiet changes felt so loud to me once I noticed them. The first time I followed her, I told myself it was accidental. I'd gone to get a glass of water and froze when I saw her silhouette ahead of me. She didn't hear me. She slipped into our son's room and shut the door almost all the way, leaving it cracked just enough to let sound escape. I stood there, heart thudding, listening to murmured words I couldn't make out. The tone wasn't soothing. It was urgent. I backed away before I could hear more, afraid of what listening might confirm. After that, sleep became impossible. Every sound felt amplified. Every creak of the house carried intent. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. How she avoided my eyes in the morning. How our son hesitated before answering simple questions. How he flinched when she called his name from another room. I asked him if everything was okay. He said yes too quickly, then buried his face in his cereal like it held the answers. I wanted to confront her. A dozen times I rehearsed the words, but they always sounded ridiculous in my head. What was I accusing her of, exactly? Caring too much? Being an attentive mother? Each time I opened my mouth, I pictured the look she'd give me, the one that said I was imagining things, so I swallowed it down and told myself to wait. Waiting felt safer than being wrong. The idea of the camera didn't come to me as a plan. It arrived as a last resort, the way desperate thoughts do. I was sitting alone in the living room, the television on mute, watching the reflection of the hallway in the dark screen. When she passed through it again, moving slow, careful, something in me hardened. I realized I didn't trust my own perceptions anymore, and that scared me more than anything she might be hiding. I bought the camera the next afternoon, telling myself I could return it. It was small, easy to hide, designed for people who didn't want to be seen watching. I held it in my hand and felt ashamed, like I was crossing a line I could never step back from. But beneath that shame was relief. Proof would end the guessing. Proof would either put my mind at ease or force me to act. I waited until the house felt settled again, until routine smoothed the edges of my fear. I installed the camera high on a shelf in the hallway angled toward our son's door. I didn't put it in his room. I told myself I wasn't that kind of man. I only needed to see who went in and how long they stayed. Even that felt like a betrayal of everything I believed about family. When I tested the feed, the image was grainy but clear enough. The hallway looked harmless through the lens, familiar and empty. I shut the app and sat there for a long time, listening to my own heartbeat. Somewhere in the house, my wife laughed at something on her phone. The normalcy of it all made my stomach twist. That night I lay awake again, waiting. When she rose from the bed, I didn't stop her. I didn't follow. I stayed still, staring into the dark, while my phone rested heavy in my hand. I told myself I wouldn't check it. I told myself I would delete the app in the morning. Then a notification buzzed softly against my palm. The screen lit up, bathing the room in a pale glow. The hallway appeared, empty at first. Then the image shifted as the camera adjusted, and I saw her step into frame. She paused outside our son's door, listening, her hand hovering over the knob like she was bracing herself. Before she went in, she looked straight down the hall toward our bedroom, as if she could feel me watching. In that moment, something irreversible clicked into place. Whatever I was about to see would change the way I understood my wife, my child, and myself. I didn't turn the screen off. I didn't look away. I held my breath as the door moved, knowing that once it closed there would be no pretending left to do. The door didn't close all the way. It stopped just short of the frame, leaving a thin slice of darkness between the room and the hallway. On the screen, I watched my wife step inside, her movements slow, controlled, like she was following rules only she knew. She didn't turn on the light. She never did. The camera clock glowed in the corner, marking seconds I felt in my teeth. I waited for her to leave. She didn't. I told myself to breathe. I told myself this was still explainable. Parents sit with their kids at night. Mothers soothe fears. But the longer she stayed, the harder it became to hold on to those excuses. My son's bed wasn't visible from the hallway angle, but I could hear faint sounds through the phone's microphone. Not words, shifts, fabric moving. The kind of noise you notice only when you're listening too hard. I set the phone down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling again, as if looking away might change what was happening. Every instinct screamed at me to get up, to walk down the hall and open that door. But another instinct, colder and steadier, told me to wait. If I interrupted now, I'd never know what I was interrupting. I hated that thought, hated the part of me that agreed with it. When she finally stepped back into the hallway, I grabbed the phone again. She stood there for a moment, shoulders slumped, like something heavy had been set down inside that room. Then she straightened, smoothed her hair, and walked back toward our bedroom. I slid the phone under my pillow and closed my eyes, just as she slipped into bed beside me. She smelled the same, soap and laundry detergent. She kissed my shoulder, whispered that everything was fine. I lay there stiff, counting the space between my breaths. Fine had never sounded like a lie before. That night I didn't sleep. I replayed the footage over and over in my mind, not because I'd seen something clear, but because I hadn't. The absence of clarity was its own kind of terror. Morning came like it always did, indifferent to whatever had broken overnight. She made breakfast. My son shuffled in, eyes down, hair sticking up in the back. She touched his shoulder as he passed, and he flinched. It was small. Anyone else might have missed it. I didn't. He sat at the table and focused on his plate like it held instructions for survival. I tried to talk to him after she left for work. Asked him about school, about his friends. He answered politely, carefully, like he was walking through a minefield. When I asked if he slept okay, his fork paused mid-air. He looked up at me, really looked, like he was measuring something. Then he nodded and said he was fine. There was that word again. I spent the day pretending to work, the camera app open on my phone like a wound I couldn't stop touching. Nothing happened. The hallway stayed empty. Normal. By the time evening rolled around, doubt crept back in. Maybe I'd imagined the tension. Maybe I was projecting fear where there was none. That hope didn't last long. That night followed the same pattern. Same quiet. Same careful movements. This time when she entered the hallway, she hesitated longer. She glanced back toward the bedroom door, then down at her hands, flexing her fingers like she was bracing herself. I felt a surge of anger then, sharp and unexpected. Whatever this was, she knew it was wrong enough to prepare for it. She went into his room again. The minutes stretched. I watched the clock tick forward. Each second an accusation. My phone vibrated softly, as the camera adjusted to movement inside the room, and I fought the urge to throw it across the bed. Instead, I held it close, my thumb hovering uselessly over the screen. I heard my son's voice this time. Not clearly, but enough to recognize the tone. He sounded confused. Uncertain. I couldn't make out words, but I knew that sound. I'd heard it before, years ago, when he was small, and didn't understand why a shot hurt or why a rule existed. Hearing it now, filtered through a phone speaker, made my vision blur. That was when I stood up. My legs moved before my head could catch up. I was halfway to the door when my phone buzzed again, harder this time. The camera view shifted, and I saw her step back into the hallway sooner than before. She closed the door behind her more firmly, her jaw set. She didn't look toward our room this time. She went straight to the bathroom. I stopped where I was, heart hammering, listening to the sink run. My hands shook so badly I had to press them against my thighs. I realized then that whatever line I thought existed between knowing and acting had already been crossed. I couldn't unknow this. I couldn't go back to pretending the house was safe just because it looked that way in daylight. Later, when the house settled again, I checked on my son. I knocked first. He told me to come in. The light was on, bright and ordinary. He sat on his bed, hugging a pillow to his chest. I asked if he was okay. He nodded. Then quietly, he asked me if people could do bad things and still think they were helping. I didn't know how to answer that. I sat beside him and told him I loved him. He leaned into me, stiff at first, then heavier, like he was finally letting go of something. As I held him, I felt a cold certainty settle in my gut. This wasn't confusion anymore. It was damage, and whatever was happening in that room at night was leaving marks I couldn't see yet. When I went back to bed, my wife was already asleep, facing away from me. I lay there staring at her back, the rise and fall of it steady and calm. I realized that the camera had shown me just enough to trap me between fear and proof, and I knew that the next step I took, whatever it was, would tear this family apart in a way I couldn't yet imagine. I stopped sleeping after that. Not the kind of sleeplessness where you toss and turn, but the kind where your body shuts down while your mind stays alert, listening for danger. Every sound in the house became a signal. Pipes shifting, the refrigerator clicking, my wife's breathing beside me. Each noise carried the same question. I couldn't ask out loud, what happens if I wait too long? I began paying attention to how she spoke to our son during the day. The words themselves sounded normal, even caring. But there was a pressure underneath them I hadn't noticed before. She corrected him constantly. How he sat, how he ate, how he answered questions. It wasn't anger. It was control. And every time she touched his shoulder or guided him by the arm, I saw him stiffen, just for a second, like his body was bracing before his mind could react. I tried again to talk to him when she wasn't around. I chose a moment that felt safe, when he was working on a puzzle at the kitchen table, the afternoon light soft and forgiving. I asked him if he ever felt uncomfortable at home. The question hung between us, heavy and dangerous. He didn't answer right away. He lined up a piece, adjusted it, then took his hands away like he was done trying. He asked me if I would be mad if he told me something. I said no, I promised. Promises are easy when you don't yet know what they'll cost. He looked toward the hallway, then back at me, his voice barely above a whisper. He said sometimes he felt like he wasn't allowed to say no. He said sometimes it felt easier to stay quiet. That was all he said. That was enough. I didn't push. I didn't ask for details. I remembered what it felt like to be a child, to test the ground before stepping fully into truth. I told him he could always say no. I told him he could always come to me, as the words left my mouth. I wondered how long he'd needed me to say them. That night, when my wife got up again, I didn't stay in bed. I waited until she was down the hall, then followed quietly, stopping just short of where the camera could see me. I watched her enter his room, watched the door settle into that same almost closed position. I stood there, my hand on the wall, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid she'd hear it. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. The fear of what I might see competed with the fear of what might happen if I did nothing. Instead, I retreated, the shame of my hesitation burning hotter than my anger. Back in the bedroom, I opened the camera feed and forced myself to watch. This time I noticed things I hadn't before. How long she stayed. How she shifted her weight from one foot to the other before leaving. How my son's movements, visible only as shadows near the floor, seemed tense, contained. When she finally stepped out, her face looked tight, controlled, like she'd just finished something difficult. She didn't look relieved. She looked resolved. The next morning I called in sick to work. I told myself I needed time to think, but really I was afraid to leave the house. I watched them interact, the careful choreography of a family pretending to be whole. She laughed too loudly at something on television. He laughed too, a beat too late. I wondered how many versions of this performance had already taken place without me noticing. I started researching quietly, not what to do exactly, but what not to do. I learned how easily accusations could backfire, how quickly the wrong move could isolate the very person I was trying to protect. Every article, every story carried the same warning: act without proof, and you risk losing everything. Act too late, and you live with the damage forever. The camera footage wasn't enough. It showed patterns, not actions. It created dread, not certainty. I realized that if I was going to step forward, I needed to be sure enough to stand by my son when the world inevitably questioned him, sure enough to face my wife and not flinch. That evening my son asked if he could sleep with the light on. She said no, before I could answer, said he was too old for that. I told her it was fine. She looked at me, surprised, annoyed. Our eyes locked for a second longer than usual. Something passed between us then. Not guilt, not fear. Assessment. Like she was recalculating. Later, after he was in bed, she confronted me in the kitchen. Asked why I was undermining her. Asked if I thought she was doing something wrong. The question was a trap. Perfectly set. I chose my words carefully. I said I thought our son needed to feel safe. I said I thought we both needed to listen more. She smiled, thin and sharp, and said I was being dramatic. That smile stayed with me long after she went to bed. It followed me into the night, into the quiet waiting. When she rose again, I didn't pretend to sleep. I watched her leave, my decisions solidifying with every step she took away from me. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I knew this silence was no longer an option. As I stared at the live feed on my phone, the hallway empty and waiting, I realized the danger had shifted. It wasn't just about what was happening behind that door anymore. It was about how far my wife was willing to go to keep it hidden. And I understood with a clarity that scared me that the next move would force her to choose between control and exposure. There stopped trying to catch her in the act. That urge had burned itself out, replaced by something colder and more deliberate. Watching the camera every night had taught me patterns, not truths, and patterns could be denied. What I needed now was understanding. Not the kind that came from spying, but the kind that came from listening when people thought they were safe to speak. I started with my son. Slowly, carefully. I didn't ask questions that cornered him. I talked about ordinary things. School, friends, movies he liked. I let silence sit between us without rushing to fill it. Silence, I'd learned, was where truth felt least threatened. One evening, while we were sitting on the living room floor sorting old photographs, he picked up a picture of himself from years earlier and asked if people could change without realizing it. I told him yes. I told him sometimes people change so gradually that only the people closest to them noticed, and sometimes not even then. He nodded like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. He didn't say anything else, but he leaned closer to me, his shoulder pressed against my arm like he was anchoring himself. I stayed still, afraid that moving might break whatever fragile trust was forming. Meanwhile, my wife grew sharper. She noticed my attention shifting, noticed that I no longer laughed at her jokes or brushed off her irritations. She accused me of being distant, of checking out. I told her I was tired. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. The air between us felt tight, charged. Conversations ended abruptly. Doors closed harder than necessary. The camera continued to capture the same ritual. Her entering the room, the long stays, the controlled exits. I archived the footage labeling dates and times, not because I knew what I'd do with it, but because the act of organizing gave me a sense of control. Each saved clip felt like a marker, proof that I wasn't imagining this pattern, even if I didn't yet understand its meaning. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, an old friend who worked in family counseling. I didn't tell him details. I framed it as a hypothetical, a concern about boundaries and parental authority. He listened, asked careful questions, warned me about jumping to conclusions. Then he said something that stuck with me. He said that harm often hides behind the language of care, and that the most dangerous situations are the ones that look responsible from the outside. That night I decided to do something I'd been avoiding. I told my wife I wanted to talk. Not argue. Talk. She agreed, though her posture said she was bracing for a fight. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place we'd once planned vacations and birthdays. I told her I was worried about our son. I told her I felt shut out. I told her the nights scared me. She laughed at first, a short, dismissive sound. She said I was paranoid, that I was projecting my own issues. She asked if I trusted her. The question landed like a weight. I said I wanted to. She leaned back, folded her arms and said that was my problem to fix. I asked her why she went into his room every night. She said he needed her. I asked why she didn't turn on the light. She said she didn't want to wake him fully. I asked why he seemed afraid. She snapped, then accused me of poisoning his mind, of undermining her authority. The shift was sudden, her voice rising, her words sharp. It was the first time I saw how quickly her calm could fracture. I ended the conversation before it spiraled further. I told her we'd talk again later. She stormed off, leaving me alone with the echo of her anger. Sitting there, I realized I'd crossed another line. She knew I was watching now, not literally, but emotionally. She knew I was no longer passive. The next interaction between her and our son felt different. She hovered more. She corrected less but watched more closely, her eyes tracking his movements like she was assessing a risk. He noticed it too. He stayed near me whenever possible, inventing reasons to be in the same room. The house felt smaller, like walls were closing in. That evening, as I was putting dishes away, my son asked if he could talk to me later, privately. My heart skipped. I told him yes, any time. He nodded, relief flickering across his face before he masked it. I waited, nerves stretched thin, while my wife busied herself in another room, her movements loud and purposeful. When my son finally came to me, it wasn't with words. He handed me a piece of paper, folded small, creased from being opened and closed too many times. It was a drawing, simple lines, stick figures. One of them was him. One was me. One was her, standing too close, her arm extended in a way that made my stomach drop. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. I looked at him, really looked, and saw fear he'd been carrying alone. I told him he'd done the right thing. I told him I was proud of him. As I said it, I knew there was no turning back. This was no longer about suspicion or proof. It was about protection. Later that night, As my wife moved down the hallway again, I didn't open the camera app. I already knew what it would show. Instead, I sat with the drawing in my hands, the paper trembling as much as my fingers. I understood then that the next step would not be quiet, careful, or reversible. And whatever happened after, our family would never return to the shape it once had. I didn't sleep at all after that. The drawing sat on the kitchen counter like an accusation that refused to be ignored. Every time I looked at it, my chest tightened, not just with anger, but with a kind of grief I hadn't expected. Grief for the version of my life where I trusted the woman I married without hesitation. Grief for the version of my son who shouldn't have needed a pencil and paper to say what he couldn't say out loud. Morning arrived quietly. Too quietly. My wife moved through the house like nothing had changed, humming softly as she made coffee. She kissed my cheek on her way past, the gesture so normal it almost broke me. I watched her hands, steady and practiced, and wondered how long she'd been this good at pretending. When she left for work, she told me not to forget the parent meeting scheduled for later. I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. As soon as the door closed behind her, I crouched in front of my son and asked him to pack a small bag. Just essentials, clothes, his favorite book. He asked if we were going somewhere. I said yes, but not yet. His eyes widened, fear and relief colliding in a way that told me he understood more than I wished he did. He didn't argue. He moved quickly, quietly, like someone who already knew the rules of staying unnoticed. I called my sister next. I hadn't spoken to her in months, not since a petty disagreement we'd both pretended mattered. When she answered, I heard myself shaking as I asked if we could come stay with her for a while. I didn't explain. I didn't have to. She said yes, immediately. That was when I realized how isolated I'd become. Without noticing, the plan formed in pieces, uneven and fragile. We wouldn't confront her yet. We wouldn't accuse. We would leave first. Distance felt like the only way to create safety without triggering whatever instinct in her demanded control. I hated that I was thinking this way, calculating exits from my own home, but the drawing burned that hesitation away. Protect first, explain later. When my wife came home that evening, she noticed the packed bag immediately. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. She asked what was going on. I told her my sister needed help, and that we'd be staying over for a bit. The lie tasted bitter, but it held. She looked at our son, then back at me, and asked why he looked nervous. I said he was tired. She crouched in front of him, her voice softening in a way that made my skin crawl. She asked if he was okay. He glanced at me before answering. That glance did something to her. I saw it, a flicker of irritation, quickly masked. She stood up and told me we needed to talk later. I agreed. I knew there wouldn't be a later. The drive to my sister's house felt unreal, like I was watching someone else make these decisions. My son sat quietly in the back seat, clutching his book like a lifeline. I checked the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see her car behind us. When we finally pulled into my sister's driveway, my hands were numb from gripping the wheel. That night, with my son asleep in the next room, I made calls I'd been avoiding, a lawyer, a counselor. I didn't tell them everything. I told them enough to get advice that felt heavy but necessary. Document everything. Prioritize safety. Be careful with confrontation. Each instruction reinforced the reality that this wasn't going to resolve cleanly. The next message from my wife came shortly after midnight. She asked when we were coming home. I didn't answer right away. I stared at the screen, thinking about how quickly worry could turn into something else. When I finally replied, I said we needed space, that I needed time to think. Her response came fast, sharp. She accused me of taking our son away from her. She said I was overreacting. She said I was hurting him. I turned the phone off after that. It felt cruel but necessary. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet, in a way that didn't feel threatening. Still, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake listening for sounds that weren't there. My body still braced for impact. The following day, my sister sat me down and asked me to tell her everything. I showed her the footage. I showed her the drawing. I watched her face change as the pieces came together. She didn't doubt me. She didn't minimize. She told me I was doing the right thing, even if it felt wrong. Hearing someone else say it out loud loosened something in my chest. My wife didn't stay silent. Messages turned into calls. Calls turned into voicemails that swung wildly between pleading and accusation. She demanded to see our son. She threatened legal action. She told me I was destroying our family. Each word felt designed to pull me back into the role she needed me to play. I didn't respond. Then came the knock on my sister's door. Unexpected, loud, my heart slammed against my ribs as I moved toward it, every instinct screaming. When I opened it, a uniform stood there. Calm, professional. He asked my name, asked if my son was inside. My wife had acted faster than I'd expected. As the officer explained why he was there, my son appeared behind me, his hand gripping my shirt. I realized then that this was the confrontation I'd been delaying. Not the one I'd planned, but the one she'd chosen. And whatever happened next would no longer be contained within the walls of our family. The officer's voice was calm, practiced, the kind of tone meant to lower temperatures, not raise them. He said my wife had reported a concern. He said she was worried about our son's safety. I felt the accusation in every neutral word. I asked if I could speak with him privately, and he nodded, stepping just far enough inside to keep the doorway open. My sister hovered behind us, silent but steady. I explained that we were staying temporarily, that there was no danger here. I said I was acting to protect my child. I didn't offer details yet. I watched the officer's eyes as I spoke, searching for judgment. What I saw instead was caution. He asked where my wife was. I said she wasn't here. He asked if I'd prevented her from seeing our son. I said no, only that I'd asked for space. Space felt like a fragile word now. He asked to speak to my son. My chest tightened. I knelt and told him he could answer honestly that he wasn't in trouble. The officer crouched to his level, asked simple questions. Did he feel safe? Did he want to be here? My son nodded, his voice small but steady when he said yes. He glanced at me once, then back at the officer. As if choosing courage deliberately, the officer stood and took notes. He said he'd document the visit. He said family matters could escalate quickly, and that courts preferred stability. He didn't say I was wrong. He didn't say I was right. When he left, the house felt heavier, like the air itself had taken sides. I locked the door and leaned against it, my legs shaking. My phone buzzed again after he was gone. A message from my wife, colder than the others. She said we would be resolving this properly. She said I'd forced her hand. I didn't reply. I sat with my son on the couch and told him he'd done well. He asked if he had to go back. I said not right now. Not if I could help it. That afternoon I met the lawyer in person. I brought the camera clips on a drive. I brought the drawing. I told the story in pieces, the way it came to me. The lawyer listened without interrupting. When I finished, he didn't rush to conclusions. He asked about routines, about authority, about consent and boundaries. He said the word patterns again, and this time it didn't feel abstract. He said we needed to be careful, but decisive. We filed for temporary custody that same day. The paperwork felt surreal. My signature at the bottom, a line separating before from after. I understood that this move would escalate things. I also understood that delay had already cost too much. The lawyer warned me that allegations could cut both ways. He warned me about retaliation. I nodded. I'd already felt it. My wife's response was immediate. She showed up at my sister's house unannounced. Her face composed, her posture rigid. She demanded to see our son. I stepped outside to meet her, keeping the door closed behind me. She accused me of poisoning him, of turning him against her. She said she was his mother, and that I was nothing without her. The words were sharp, chosen to wound. I told her to leave. I told her we'd speak through lawyers. She laughed, a sound devoid of humor, and said I thought I was smarter than I was. She said I'd regret this. As she walked away, I felt something break loose inside me, a mix of fear and resolve. Threats were no longer subtle. They were declared. That night, I slept lightly, my senses tuned too high. I dreamed of doors that wouldn't open. I woke to the sound of my phone ringing, a number I didn't recognize. I answered anyway. A woman introduced herself, careful, official. She said she'd received a report. She said she needed to schedule an interview. The machinery had started moving. The interview happened in a small office, with neutral walls. My son waited outside with my sister. The questions were gentle, but precise. I answered honestly, resisting the urge to defend myself beyond the facts. When they asked why I hadn't confronted my wife earlier, I said I was afraid of being wrong. I said I was afraid of making it worse. The woman nodded like she'd heard that before. Afterward, my son went in. The wait felt endless. When he came out, his eyes were red, but he stood straighter. He didn't say much, just asked if we could get ice cream. We did. The normalcy of it felt like a gift I hadn't known to ask for. The next development came faster than I expected. A temporary order, supervised contact only. The language was clinical, the effect seismic. My wife reacted with fury. Messages flooded in from numbers I didn't recognize. Friends asking what was going on, family choosing sides. I stayed quiet, protecting the perimeter of my son's world as best I could. One evening, as I was tucking him in, he asked if this was his fault. The question cut deeper than any threat. I told him no, that adults are responsible for their choices. I told him speaking up was brave. He nodded, absorbing it like a rule he'd carry forward. Later, alone, I watched the camera footage again, not for proof, but for resolve. I needed to remember why I'd stepped into this fire. Outside, the world continued. Unaware. Inside, our lives had split into two paths, and I knew the harder one was just beginning. The waiting changed me more than the confrontation ever did. Once the orders were in place, and the noise of immediate crisis faded, a quieter pressure settled over everything. It was the pressure of not knowing what would come next, of living inside a process that moved according to rules I hadn't written in timelines I couldn't control. Each morning I woke up braced, my body already preparing for impact before my mind caught up. My son adapted faster than I expected. He followed the new routines without complaint, keeping his world small and predictable. School, home, meals, sleep. He asked fewer questions now, as if he'd learned that answers sometimes brought consequences, that awareness hurt more than his fear ever had. I made it a point to sit with him every night, to remind him without words that he wasn't alone, that he didn't have to manage this by himself anymore. My wife didn't accept the boundaries quietly. She challenged them at every opportunity, filing motions, making accusations that forced responses. Each envelope from a lawyer made my stomach clench. I read every word twice, looking for traps. She painted herself as a mother denied her child, careful to frame concern as injustice. I learned quickly how easily language could be bent to suit intention. Friends started reaching out, confused by rumors they'd heard. I kept my explanations brief. I didn't offer details. I said we were dealing with family issues, and left it at that. Some understood. Others drifted away, uncomfortable with ambiguity. I let them go. Clarity mattered more than approval now. The supervised visits began soon after. Neutral rooms, neutral observers. I stayed away, as instructed. But I waited nearby, my nerves stretched thin. My son returned from the first visit. Quiet, thoughtful. I asked, how it went. He said it was strange. He said she kept smiling too much. That answer told me everything. Over time, patterns emerged even there. She pushed boundaries subtly, asking questions she shouldn't, trying to draw him into adult concerns. Each incident was documented. Each note added weight to a file I never wanted to exist. The system moved slowly, but it moved. One afternoon, my lawyer called with an update. There would be a formal evaluation. Experts. Interviews. Observations. The word scrutiny echoed in my head long after the call ended. I worried about how my son would handle it, about what it would ask of him emotionally. I worried too about myself. About whether my choices would be dissected until they looked reckless, instead of protective. The evaluation process was invasive, but thorough. We answered questions about our marriage, our parenting, our histories. I spoke honestly about my doubts, my delays, my mistakes. I refused to paint myself as a hero. I didn't need to be one. I needed to be credible. My wife, I was told later, presented herself as composed, misunderstood, unfairly targeted. Two narratives, colliding. During this time, my son had a setback. Nightmares returned. Brief, but intense. He woke up shaking, calling my name. I held him until the fear passed, reminding myself that healing wasn't linear. The counselor assured me this was normal, that progress often stirred old feelings before settling into something new. I clung to that reassurance more than I let on. Then came the reset moment I hadn't anticipated. New information surfaced, not from the footage or the drawings, but from someone outside our immediate circle, a professional who had noticed inconsistencies, who had documented concerns long before I'd acted. Hearing that both devastated and relieved me. Devastated that this had been visible before I'd seen it. Relieved that I hadn't been alone in my unease. The balance shifted after that, subtly, but unmistakably. Questions directed at my wife became sharper. Recommendations changed. The tone of conversations adjusted, less neutral, more focused. I stayed cautious. I knew better than to celebrate early. My wife sensed the shift too. Her messages turned desperate, then angry, then silent. When she did speak, it was through counsel. The distance between us became formal, procedural. I grieved that loss more than I expected. Not for the marriage, but for the illusion that had once sustained it. One evening, as I sat watching my son build something elaborate out of blocks, he looked up and asked if things would ever feel normal again. I didn't answer right away. I thought about what normal meant now. I told him things would feel different, but safer. He considered that, then nodded, satisfied enough. The hearing date loomed. Preparation consumed everything. I reviewed timelines, statements, evidence. I slept little, ate less. But beneath the exhaustion was a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. I knew why I was here. I knew what I was protecting. On the morning of the hearing, I stood in the mirror and barely recognized myself. Older, harder, but clearer. I picked up my keys, my folder, and took a deep breath. Whatever happened next, the truth was finally stepping into the light, and this time I wasn't backing away. The courthouse didn't look intimidating from the outside. That almost made it worse. It sat there like any other public building, neutral and indifferent, as if it hadn't swallowed entire lives before breakfast. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because waiting at home felt unbearable. My lawyer met me near the entrance, his expression professional, unreadable. He said we were as ready as we could be. I nodded, knowing readiness was a fragile illusion. Inside, everything moved, slowly. Security checks, paperwork, hallways that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. When I sat down, my hands rested flat on my knees, the way I'd taught my son to sit when he was nervous. I wondered briefly if he was thinking of me too, wherever he was at that moment. My wife entered from the opposite side of the room. She didn't look at me. She sat upright, shoulders back, composed to the point of stiffness. If I hadn't lived with her for years, I might have mistaken that posture for strength. Now I recognized it as armor. We were no longer a couple. We were opposing stories waiting to be weighed. The proceedings began with formalities, language stripped of emotion, dates, motions, summaries. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and told the truth as plainly as I could. I spoke about the nights, the patterns, the fear that had crept in slowly and refused to leave. I spoke about my hesitation, my doubt, my regret for not acting sooner. I didn't embellish, I didn't dramatize. I let the facts carry their own weight. Then came the questions. Some were expected, others less so. Why had I installed a camera? Why hadn't I confronted her directly? Why had I chosen to leave instead of seek mediation? Each question felt like a test, not just of my actions, but of my character. I answered honestly, even when honesty made me look flawed, especially then. My wife's testimony followed. She spoke confidently, framing herself as a misunderstood parent, a victim of overreaction. She described me as distant, unreliable, prone to suspicion. She suggested my concern was rooted in jealousy and control, not protection. Hearing myself described that way was disorienting, like watching someone else wear my face. The evaluation reports were introduced next. Neutral voices, clinical language, observations, patterns, recommendations. I watched the judge's expression carefully, trying to read shifts in attention, in emphasis. When references were made to external documentation, to concerns that predated my actions, something tightened in my chest. Validation and sorrow collided, inseparable. A break was called midway through. I stepped into the hallway, my legs unsteady. My lawyer spoke quietly, reassuring without promising outcomes. He said things were going as expected. I leaned against the wall, breathing through the nausea, reminding myself that control was no longer the goal. Clarity was. When proceedings resumed, the focus turned to my son, not his presence but his experience. His words, filtered through professionals. His drawings, his statements. The room felt smaller then, as if the air itself had shifted to accommodate the weight of a child's truth. I kept my eyes forward, afraid that if I looked at my wife, I'd see something I couldn't unsee. The decision wasn't announced immediately. It rarely is. Instead, timelines were set, interim measures outlined, temporary arrangements extended, conditions clarified. It was progress, but not resolution. As we filed out, my wife brushed past me without a word. For the first time, she looked uncertain, not angry, not composed, just unsure. Outside, the light felt harsh. I sat in my car and didn't start it right away. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, the adrenaline draining from my system all at once. I realized I was exhausted in a way. Sleep wouldn't fix. This process had taken more than time. It had taken pieces of me I'd never get back. When I returned to my sister's house, my son was waiting. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't need details. He looked at my face and seemed to understand enough. We sat together on the porch. The quiet, comfortable. I told him I was proud of him again. I told him he was brave. He nodded, accepting the words without deflecting them this time. Later that evening, a message came from my wife's lawyer. It was formal, measured, a proposal. Compromises offered. Conditions accepted. Reading between the lines, I saw concession, not admission, but retreat. The danger hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. Power was no longer one-sided. That night, I dreamed of doors opening instead of closing, of rooms filled with light. When I woke, the fear was still there, but it was quieter, less sharp. I knew we weren't done. Final decisions still loomed. Consequences hadn't fully landed. But something fundamental had changed. I sat at the kitchen table the next morning. Paperwork spread out. Sunlight cutting across the wood. My son ate breakfast nearby, humming softly. For the first time in a long while, the sound didn't make me tense. It grounded me. Reminded me why every hard choice had been made. I understood then that revenge had never been my motivation. Protection was. And sometimes, protection looks like patience, like endurance, like standing in rooms you never wanted to enter, and speaking truths you hoped you'd never need to say. The final outcome was approaching, slowly but inevitably. I could feel it in the way conversations shifted, in the way resistance softened. Whatever form it took, it would reshape all of us. I wasn't naive enough to think it would bring peace, but it would bring clarity. And for now, that was enough to keep going. The final decision arrived without ceremony. No dramatic phone call, no urgent knock. Just an email notification that sat unread for several minutes while I stared at it, my finger hovering over the screen like it might burn me. When I finally opened it, the language was formal and restrained, but the meaning was unmistakable. Custody confirmed. Conditions set, boundaries enforced. The uncertainty that had ruled our lives for so long had finally been given a shape. I didn't feel relief right away. What I felt was weight, the kind that settles into your bones after a long storm, when you realize you've been bracing for so long that you've forgotten how to stand normally. I read the document twice, then a third time, afraid I'd misunderstood something. Each line held, solid and immovable. When I closed my phone, my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with release. My wife didn't respond immediately. When she did, it was through counsel, brief and procedural. There was no apology. No admission, just acknowledgement. I realized then that I would never get the moment of reckoning I'd once imagined. No confession, no dramatic collapse. Accountability, I learned, doesn't always arrive the way stories teach us to expect. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in policy and paperwork, and that has to be enough. But telling my son was harder than facing any courtroom. I waited until we were alone, sitting at the same table where the drawing had once changed everything. I explained that he would stay with me, that visits would happen differently now, that adults were making sure he was safe. He listened carefully, his face unreadable. When I finished, he asked one question. He asked if it was okay to feel both happy and sad at the same time. I told him yes. I told him that meant he was human. He leaned back in his chair thinking, then smiled faintly. Not a big smile, just enough. In that moment, I saw something loosen inside him, a tension he'd been carrying longer than I'd known. It didn't vanish, but it eased. Life didn't snap back into place after that. It rearranged itself slowly, awkwardly, like furniture moved by someone who was still learning the room. We found new routines, new silences, new ways of filling them. Counseling became a regular part of our lives, not as a fix, but as maintenance. I learned how much I had to unlearn, how many moments I'd mistaken for normal simply because they were familiar. There were setbacks, triggers we didn't anticipate, days when my son withdrew, when old fears resurfaced without warning. I stayed present through all of it, reminding myself that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something sturdier in its place. Some nights, after he fell asleep, I sat alone and let myself feel everything I'd held back. The anger, the grief, the guilt. Letting it surface felt dangerous, but necessary. My wife faded into the background of our lives, not entirely gone, but no longer central. Supervised visits continued, structured and contained. Over time, her intensity dulled, replaced by a kind of resignation. I stopped trying to interpret her emotions. They were no longer my responsibility. Protecting my son was. One evening, months after the decision, my son brought out a new drawing. This one was different. Two figures, him and me, standing side by side. No crowding, no looming shapes. He handed it to me without explanation, then went back to what he was doing. I stood there holding it, my throat tight, understanding exactly what he was telling me. The house feels different now. Not quiet in the same dangerous way, quiet like a pause between breaths. Sometimes I catch myself listening for sounds that no longer come, my body slow to accept safety. When that happens, I ground myself in the present, in the clink of dishes, in my son's laughter drifting down the hall, in the simple radical fact that we are here. I've been asked if I regret installing the camera, if I regret waiting, if I regret the choices that fractured our family. The truth is complicated. I regret the harm. I regret the delay. I regret the innocence that was lost. But I don't regret acting when I did. I don't regret choosing discomfort over denial. I don't regret believing my child when belief mattered most. Revenge was never part of my story, not in the way people expect. There was no grand payoff, no moment where everything balanced neatly. What there was instead was protection, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I didn't look away when it mattered. Justice, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, steady and persistent, and asks you to keep going. As I write this, my son is in the next room, humming to himself, building something new out of old pieces. The sound carries through the house, soft and unafraid. I don't know what the future holds for either of us. I know there will be challenges. I can't predict, questions I won't know how to answer right away. But I also know this: the cycle stopped here. I didn't save him by being perfect. I saved him by being present, by listening when it was uncomfortable, by choosing action over peace. And in doing that, I found something unexpected for myself as well. Not closure, not triumph, but clarity, and with it a chance to build a life defined not by what we escaped, but by what we chose to protect.